2 of Vicious, written by Victoria Schwab and read by Noah Michael Levine. Chapter 2. This morning, the Esquire Hotel. Victor savored the scalding water of the hotel shower as he rinsed the last of the grave dirt from his skin. Barry Lynch had been surprisingly receptive when he revisited the cemetery this morning. Victor had gone back just before dawn, scooped out the foot of dirt he'd put back on top of Lynch to make the grave look empty if anyone chanced to walk by, and pried the lid off to find Barry's terrified eyes staring up at him. Pain and fear are inextricable, a lesson that went back to Victor's studies at Lockland. But pain has multiple forms. Victor might not be able to physically hurt Barry Lynch, but that didn't mean he couldn't make him suffer. Barry, for his part, seemed to get the message. Victor had smiled and helped the once-dead man out of his coffin, even though he hated the way the man's strangely nerveless skin felt against his own. And as he passed him the note and sent him on his way, Victor felt confident that Lynch would follow through. But just to be certain, he told him one last thing. He'd taken several steps back, and then turned toward Barry and said it as an afterthought. "The girl, Sydney, the one who brought you back. She can change her mind at any point, snap her fingers, and drop you like a stone. Or, rather, a corpse. Do you want to see?" he asked. Digging the phone from his pocket, he began to dial. "It's really quite a clever trick." Barry had paled and shaken his head, and Victor had sent him on his way. "Hey, Vale!" Mitch's voice reached him through the bathroom walls. "Get out here!" He snapped the shower water off. "Victor!" Mitch was still shouting his name when he stepped into the hall a minute later, toweling off his hair. Sun was streaming in through the tall windows, and he winced at the brightness. Late morning, at least. His message should be well on its way. "What is it?" asked Victor, at first worried, but then he saw Mitch's face, the broad, open smile. Whatever the man had done, he was proud of it. Sydney appeared, with Doll close behind, his tail wagging lazily. "Come see this." Mitch gestured to the profile spread out on the kitchen counter. Victor sighed. There were more than a dozen now, and most of them dead ends, he was sure. They couldn't seem to get the search matrix exact enough. He'd spent the previous evening and most of the night looking over pages, wondering how Eli did it, if he followed every lead, or if he knew something Victor didn't, saw something Victor hadn't. Now, before his eyes, Mitch began turning papers face down, eliminating profile after profile from the mix, until only 3 were left. One was the blue-haired girl, and the second an older man he'd studied last night. But the third was new. It must have been freshly printed. "This," said Mitch, "is Eli's current list of targets." Victor's cool eyes flicked up. He began to shift his weight from foot to foot. His fingers tapped out a beat. "How did you figure that out?" "It's a great story. Stand still and I'll tell you." Victor forced himself to stop moving. "Go on," he said, scanning the names and faces. "So, I'm seeing this pattern," said Mitch. "I keep ending up in police files. Merit police files. So I think, what if the cops are already working on their own database, right? Maybe we could compare it with ours. You mentioned way back when that one cop knowing about EOs. Or someone with the cops. And then I think, hey, maybe I can just borrow their data, instead of going through all the hassle. I mean, it's nothing beyond my reach, but it takes time. But what if they've done some of the work for me? So I start browsing in Merit PD's Persons of Interest database, and something catches my eye. I used to love those puzzles growing up where they ask you to spot the difference. I rocked that shit. Anyway, they're flagged," said Victor, eyes skimming the profiles. Mitch's posture fell. "Man, you always ruin the punchline. But yeah, and I made it easy for you to see," he said as he pouted. "I turned the pages down. Easy to see a pattern when it's all that's in front of you." "What do you mean flagged?" asked Sydney, standing on her tiptoes to see the pages. "Look," Victor said, gesturing to the profiles. "What do all these people have in common?" Sid squinted at the paper, but shook her head. "The middle names," said Victor. Sidney read them out loud.
Elise, Ellington, Alyssa. They all have Eli in them.
Exactly, said Mitch. They've been flagged, specifically for our friend Eli, which means— He's working with the cops, said Victor. Here in Merritt. Sidney stared down at the photo of the girl with the blue hair.
How can you be sure? She asked. What if it's a coincidence?
Mitch looked smug. Because I did my homework. I cross-checked the theory by pulling up some of their old profiles. Persons of interest now deceased, all of which had conveniently found their way into the digital trash bin. Which is its own red flag, by the way, but I found matches to Eli's killings over the last 4 months. He dropped the dead EO folder on the table, including your man Barry Lynch, the one you just spent the night digging up. Victor had started to pace. It gets better, said Mitch. The flagged profiles were created by one of 2 cops. He tapped the right corner of a page. Officer Frederick Dane or Detective Mark Stell? Victor's chest tightened. Stell. What were the odds? The man who'd had Victor arrested 10 years ago, the one who'd been on EO duty at the Lockland precinct, and the one who, when Victor recovered from his multiple gunshot wounds, personally escorted him to the isolation wing of Wrighton Penitentiary. Stell's involvement, along with Eli's testimony, was the reason Victor spent 5 years in solitary confinement. He wasn't declared an EO on the records, of course, only in extreme danger to himself and others, and it had taken him half a decade of deliberately not hurting anyone, at least not in a conscious or appreciable way, to get himself integrated. You listening? Asked Mitch. Victor nodded absently. The men flagging the profiles, they are, or have been, in direct contact with Eli. Exactly. Victor toasted the air with his water, his thoughts miles away. Bravo, Mitch. He turned to Sidney. You hungry? But Sidney didn't seem to be listening. She had taken up the folder with the dead EOs and was flipping through almost absently when she stopped. Victor looked over her shoulder and saw what she saw. Short blonde hair and water-blue eyes stared up at her beside a cleanly printed name, Sidney Eleanor Clark.
My middle name is Marion, she said quietly. And he thinks I'm dead.
Victor stooped over and swiped the page. He folded the page and tucked it inside his shirt pocket with a wink. Not for long, he said, tapping his watch. Not for long. Chapter 3. This morning, Tidings Well Bank. Eli parked a block and a half from the yellow tape of the crime scene barrier and repositioned the prop glasses on his nose before getting out. He could see, as he wound his way behind the eyes of the crowd of morbid spectators and the gathering photographers, to the back of the bank, and the crime was no longer in progress. People lingered, lights flashed, but the relative quiet, sirenless, gunless, shoutless, told him enough. He stiffened when he saw Detective Stell, even though Serena promised it was safe. Still, the detective had come to Merritt a few months before to investigate a string of killings in the area, Eli's handiwork, of course, and even Serena's assurances couldn't entirely wipe away Eli's doubt regarding the detective's loyalty. Stell, who now had salt-and-pepper hair and a permanent crease between his eyes, met him behind the building and lifted the tape so he could pass. Eli pushed the prop glasses up his nose a second time. They were a fraction too big. How Clark Kent of you, said Stell dryly. Eli was not in the mood. Where is he? Dead. The detective led the way into the bank. I told you I wanted him alive. Didn't have a choice. He started firing, or whatever you want to call it. Couldn't aim worth a damn, like that power of his was on the fritz. Didn't stop him from making a mess, though. Civilians? No. He ordered those all out. They reached a black sheet cast over a vaguely human shape. Stell nudged it with his boot. Media wants to know why a madman who's supposed to be dead enters a bank with a weapon, but doesn't try to rob it and doesn't take any prisoners. All he does is kick everyone out and fire at the air and scream for someone named Eli Ever. We should have never let that story run last week. Can't stop the press from using their eyes, Eli. You're the one who wanted to make a scene." Eli didn't like the man's tone, had never liked it, never trusted the thread of combativeness that ran through it. "I needed a demonstration," Eli growled. He didn't want to admit that there was more to it than that he wanted an audience. It had been Serena's idea, he was sure, before it became his. "A demonstration is one thing," said Stell. "But did you need a spectacle?" "It covered up the murder," said Eli as he threw back the black sheet. "How was I supposed to know he wouldn't stay dead?" Barry Lynch's brown eyes gazed up at him, shallow and dead. He could hear the whispers from the other cops milling around, hushed voices wondering who he was, what he was doing there. He tried to look official as he stared down at the dead man. "You dragged me out here for nothing," he said under his breath. "Now that he's dead." "Forgive me, but he was dead before, remember? Besides," added Stell, "this time he left a note." Stell handed Eli a plastic bag. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper. He withdrew the paper and unfolded it gingerly. It was a stick figure drawing, 2 people holding hands. A thin man in black and a girl half his height with short hair and wide eyes. The stick girl's head was cocked slightly, and a small red spot marked her arm. 3 similar spots, no bigger than periods, dotted the stick man's chest. The stick man's mouth was nothing more than a faint, grim line. Beneath the drawing ran a single sentence. "I made a friend. Victor." "You okay?" Eli blinked, felt the cop's hand on his arm. He slid free, folded the paper, and put it in his pocket before anyone could see or say otherwise. "Get rid of the body," he said to Stell. "Burn it this time." Eli went back the way he'd come. He didn't stop, not until he was safely in his car. In the relative privacy of the side street in Merritt, he pressed his hand against the drawing in his pocket, and a phantom pain started in his stomach. Victor lifted the knife from the table. "You called the cops and you accused me of being an EO? I didn't rat you out, you know. I could have. Why would you tell them something so silly? Did you know they have special people that come in if there's an EO suspected? Some guy named Stell, did you know that?" "You've lost it," Eli sidestepped. "Put the knife down. It's not like you can hurt me." Victor smiled then. He looked like someone else. Eli tried to step back, but the wall came up behind him. The knife buried itself in his stomach. He felt the tip scratch at the skin of his back. The pain had been sharp, persistent, dragging itself out instead of flashing forward and dissolving. "You know what I figured out?" Victor growled. "Watching you in the street that night, picking the glass from your hand. You can't heal yourself until I take the knife out." He twisted it, and pain exploded behind Eli's eyes, a dozen colors. He groaned and began to slide down the wall, but Victor hoisted him up by the handle. "I'm not even using my gift yet," Victor said. "It's not as flashy as yours, but it's rather effective. Want to see?" Eli swallowed hard and dialed Serena as he put the car in gear and headed for the hotel. He didn't wait for her to speak. "We have a problem." Chapter 4. 10 years ago, Lockland University. Eli Ever sat on the steps of his apartment in the cold morning and ran his fingers through his hair before realizing they were covered in blood. Caution tape surrounded him in streamers of yellow, too bright against the dull winter dawn. Red and blue lights dotted the icy ground, and every time he looked at them, he ended up spending minutes trying to blink the colors away. "If you could tell us one more time," said a young cop. Eli touched his stomach, the echo of pain still there, even though the skin had healed. He rubbed his hands together and watched blood flake off into the sidewalk snow. He wove a distress he wasn't sure he felt back into his voice as he recounted everything from Victor's panicked call the night before, confessing to Angie's murder, to his sudden appearance in their living room, gun in hand. Eli left out the knives, having scrubbed and returned them to their drawers before the police arrived. It was odd, the way his brain had made space around the weedy panic, helping his hands and legs do what needed to be done, even as a fading voice in the back of his mind screamed, and his best friend lay shot full of holes on their living room floor. Something in Eli had gone missing. Fear. That's what he'd told Victor. Right down the drain with the icy bath water. "So you wrested the gun from Mr. Vale?" Wrested had been Eli's word, not the officer's. "I taught a self-defense seminar last summer," he lied. "It's not that hard." And then he pushed himself shakily to his feet. He was covered in blood, arms curled carefully around his ribs to hide the knife hole in his shirt. 2 other officers had already questioned him about it. He told them he got lucky. He didn't know how the weapon could have missed him, but it did, obviously. Look, hole in shirt, no hole in Eli. Fortunately, the cops had been too interested in Victor's bleeding out on the hardwood floor to care much about Eli's magic trick. One lucky man, they muttered, and he wasn't sure if they'd been talking about him or Victor, who had managed to avoid dying, for now. "And then you shot him 3 times? "I was distraught. He'd just killed my girlfriend." Eli wondered if he was in shock, if that was the thing keeping Angie's death from sinking in the way the knife had. He wanted to care. He wanted to care so badly. But there was this gap between what he felt and what he wanted to feel, a space where something important had been carved out, and it was growing. He'd told Victor the thing he lost was his fear, but that wasn't quite true, because he was still scared. He was scared of that rift. "And then?" prompted the cop. Eli rubbed his eyes. "And then he came after me. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I tried not to kill him." He swallowed, wishing he had a glass of water. "Look, do you think I could go clean up?" he asked, gesturing to his ruined clothes. "I need to go see Angie. Her body." The officer called past the yellow tape and was given the all-clear. The ambulance was long gone. All that was left was a mess. The officer held up the tape to let him pass. A trail of red wound through the living room. Eli stopped and stared at it. The fight replayed behind his eyes as relentlessly as the police lights, and he forced himself to veer toward the bathroom. When he caught sight of himself in the bank of mirrors, he stifled a laugh, one of those ill, half-way-to tears laughs. Blood stained his shirt, his pants, his face, his hair. Eli did his best to wash it off, scrubbing his arms OR style in the sink. His favorite shirt, a bold red one that Victor always said made him look like a ripe tomato, was ruined. Victor. Victor was wrong. About everything. "If I'm missing something, then so are you. Life is about compromises. Or did you think because you put yourself in God's hands that He would make you all you were and more?" "He did," said Eli aloud to the sink. "He did. He would. He had to. Whatever this gap was, it was there for a reason, there to make him stronger. He had to believe that." Eli washed his face, cupped water over his hair until the red ran out of it. He pulled on fresh clothes and was just about to duck back under the yellow tape across his front door when he caught the end of the young officer's remark to another cop. "Yeah, Detective Stell is on his way." Eli paused and stepped backward into the apartment. "Did you know they have special people that come in if there's an EO suspected? Some guy named Stell. I bet you didn't know that." Eli turned, made a line for the back door, only to find his path blocked by a very large cop. "Everything all right, sir?" asked the cop. Eli gave a slow nod. "Door's taped," he said. "Just trying to get out of everyone's way." The large cop nodded and stepped aside. Eli was through the back door and into the small communal courtyard by the time the large officer reached the younger one. He didn't look guilty, he told himself. Not yet. Victor was the guilty one. The Victor that he knew was dead, replaced by something cold and vicious. A twisted, violent version of himself. Victor had never been good or sweet. He'd always had a sharp edge. Eli had been drawn to the metallic glint of it, but he'd never been this, a murderer, a monster. After all, he'd killed Angie. How? How had it happened? With pain? Was that possible? The medical part of his mind tried to break it down. A heart attack? Would the pain cause a short circuit, like electricity? Would the body shut down? Would the functions freeze? He dug his nail into his palms. This was Angie. Not a science experiment. A person. The one who'd made him feel better, saner, kept him afloat when his mind began to sink. What was it then? Was Angie the missing thing? Wouldn't it be lovely to make the gap another person instead of a part of himself? But no. That wasn't it. Angie had helped. She'd always helped. But he'd felt the hole before she died. Felt it even before he died. The feeling, the lack of it, had only ever come in glimpses, like a cloud passing overhead. But from the moment he woke up on the bathroom floor, the shadow had settled over him, a sign that something was wrong. Not wrong, he forced himself to think. Different. Eli got to his car, thankful he'd parked 2 blocks away, less chance of getting a ticket there, and threw it into gear. He drove past the engineering labs, slowing only enough to see the yellow tape there, too, marking out Victor's path of destruction, and the huddle of emergency vehicles. He needed to get to the pre-med buildings as fast as possible. He needed to find Professor Line. Eli strode through the automatic doors and into the lobby of the 3 clustered buildings reserved for the medical sciences, an empty backpack slung on one shoulder. The lobby of the center lab had been painted an awful pale yellow. He wasn't sure why they insisted on painting labs such sickly shades, maybe to prepare the pre-med students for the equally sad palettes of most of the hospitals they aspired to work in, or perhaps on some misguided notion that pale meant clean. But the color made the place seem lifeless, now more than ever. Eli kept his head down as he made his way up 2 flights of stairs until he reached the office where he'd spent most of his free time since the start of winter break. Professor Line's nameplate hung on the door, letters gleaming. Eli tried the handle. It was locked. He searched his pockets for something to use on the lock and came up with a paperclip. If it worked on television, it could work here. He knelt before the handle. Before Victor had come back to campus, Eli had taken his discovery to Professor Line, who had gone from skeptical to intrigued as his theories gained weight. Eli had enjoyed getting the professor's attention back in the fall, but it was nothing compared to the relish he felt earning Line's respect. His research, now their research, had taken on a new focus under the professor's guidance, reinterpreting the hypothetical qualities of existing EOs, the NDEs, and their physical and psychological aftermath, into a potential system for locating them, a kind of search matrix. At least, that had been the chartered course of study until Victor showed up and suggested that they could potentially make an EO instead. Eli had never shared this idea with Professor Line. He hadn't had the chance. After Victor's failed attempt, Eli had become too preoccupied with his own trial, and then, after his success, and it was a success, missing pieces aside, he hadn't wanted to share. He'd been watching Line's interest sharpen from curiosity into fascination in a way that Eli knew well, certainly well enough to distrust it. Now he was glad he'd kept the new direction to himself. In less than a week, Eli's research had ended Angie's life, ruined Victor's, if he lived, and changed his own. Even though the dark turn in the thesis and the ensuing destruction had both been Victor's fault, his actions had also revealed the grim truth of their discoveries, and where they would inevitably lead. And now Eli knew exactly what he had to do.
"Can I help you?"
Eli looked up from his lock-picking, which wasn't going well, to find a janitor leaning on a broom, eyes flicking from Eli to his straightened paperclip. He forced a casual laugh and stood up. "I hope so. God, I'm such an idiot. I left a folder in Line's office. He's my advisor. I need it for my thesis." He was talking too fast, the way actors did on TV when they wanted the audience to pick up on the fact that they were lying. His hands were slick. He paused, forcing himself to breathe. "Have you seen him, by the way?" Inhale. Exhale. "I can wait around a little while." Inhale. Exhale. Be the first rest I've had in weeks. He stopped and waited to see if the janitor would buy the story. After a long moment, the man pulled a set of keys from his pocket and unlocked the door. I haven't seen him yet, but he should be in soon. And in the future, he offered as he turned away, it takes 2 paper clips. Eli smiled with genuine relief, waved his thanks, and went inside, urging the door closed with a click. He let out a low sigh and got to work. There are times when the marvels of scientific advancement expedite our processes, making our lives easier. Modern technology provides machines that can think 3 or 5 or 7 steps ahead of the human mind, machines that offer elegant solutions, a selection of contingency plans, B's and C's and D's, in case A isn't to your liking. And then, there are times when a screwdriver and a bit of elbow grease are all that's necessary to get the job done. Eli admitted that it wasn't terribly creative or aesthetically pleasing, but it was efficient. Their research was stored in 2 places. The first was a blue folder in the 3rd drawer of the wall cabinet, which Eli removed and slid into his backpack. The second was on the computer. He dismantled Professor Lyne's computer the simplest, most fail-safe way he knew how, by physically removing the hard drive and crushing it underfoot, then putting the remnants into his backpack alongside the folder with the intent of tossing the whole bag into some crematorium or wood chipper for good measure. He'd have to hope Professor Lyne didn't think to store a copy of the research anywhere else. Eli zipped the bag closed and did his best to position the computer so that at first glance it didn't appear to be missing a hard drive at all. He had just shouldered the backpack and returned to the hall and was in the process of trying to relock Lyne's office door when he heard a cough and turned to find the professor himself barring his path, coffee in one hand, briefcase in the other. They considered each other, Eli's hand still resting on the doorknob. "Good morning, Mr. Cardale." "I'm withdrawing my thesis," said Eli without preamble. Lyne's brow crinkled. "But you'll fail." Eli shifted the bag and pushed past him. "I don't care." "Eli," said Professor Lyne, following. "What's this about? What's going on?" They were alone in the hall. Eli spoke, but didn't slow his pace. "It has to stop," he said under his breath. "Right now, it was a mistake." "But we're just getting started," said Professor Lyne. Eli shoved the door into the stairwell open and stepped onto the landing, Lyne trailing behind him. "The discoveries you've made," said Lyne. "The ones we'll make, they'll change the world." Eli turned on him. "Not for the better," he said. "We can't pursue this. Where does it lead? We make it possible to find EOs. And then what? They get taken, examined, dissected, explained, and someone decides to stop studying and start creating." His stomach twisted. It would happen just like that, wouldn't it? He was proof. Wooed by the prospect, the potential, the chance to prove something instead of disprove. Do you ever wonder? "Would that be so bad?" asked Lyne. "To create something extraordinary?" "They aren't extraordinary," snapped Eli. "They're wrong." Eli blamed himself. Victor was right. He'd played God, even as he asked for his help, and God, in his mercy and might, had saved Eli's life, but destroyed everything that touched it. "I won't give anyone the tools to make more of them. All these roads lead to ruin." "Don't be dramatic." "It's over. I'm done." Eli's grip tightened on the bag. Lyne's eyes narrowed. "I'm not," said Lyne, his hand coming up to rest on Eli's shoulder, fingers curling around the backpack strap. "We have an obligation to science, Mr. Cardale. The research must continue, and discoveries of this magnitude must be shared. Stop being so selfish." Lyne gave a sharp tug on the bag, but Eli stood his ground, and before he knew what was happening, the 2 men were fighting over the backpack. Eli shoved Lyne off him and up against the railing, and somewhere in the struggle, Lyne's elbow met Eli's lip hard, splitting it. Eli wiped the blood away and ripped the bag from Lyne's grip, tossing it to the side only to realize that Lyne had stopped fighting for it. The professor stood, eyes wide, and Eli felt before he saw in Line's eyes what was happening. The skin of his lip knit cleanly back together. "You!" Eli saw Line's expression shift from shock to glee. "You did it! You're one of them!" He could already see the experiments, the papers, the press, the obsession. "You are an—" Line didn't get a chance to finish, because at that moment Eli gave him a sharp shove backward down the stairs. The word was drawn out into a short cry, then cut off sharply by the first of several thuds as Line's body tumbled down the steps. He hit the bottom with a crack. Eli stared down at the body, willing himself to feel horrified. He didn't. There it was again, that gap between what he knew he should feel and what he did, mocking him as he looked down at Line. Eli wasn't sure if he meant to push the professor down the stairs, or if he'd only meant to push him away, but the damage was done now. It was Victor's idea, putting the theory to the test, he found himself saying as he descended the steps. The method took some tweaking, but it worked. That's why I know this has to stop. Line twitched, his mouth opened, made a sound between a groan and a gasp. Because it works, and because it's wrong. Eli stopped at the base of the stairs beside his teacher. I died begging for the strength to survive, and it was granted. But it's a trade, Professor, with God or the devil, and I've paid for my gift with the lives of my friends. Every EO has sold a part of themselves they can never have back. Don't you see? He knelt beside Line, whose fingers twitched. I can't let anyone else sin so heinously against nature. Eli knew what he had to do, felt it with a strange and comforting certainty. He brought one hand almost gently under Line's jaw, the other cradling his chin. This research dies with us. With that, he twisted sharply. Well, said Eli softly, with you. Line's eyes emptied, and Eli set his head gently back against the ground, sliding his fingers free as he stood. There was a moment of such perfect quiet, the kind he used to feel in church, a sliver of peace that felt so right. It was the first time he'd felt like himself, like more than himself, since he'd come back to life. Eli crossed himself. Then he made his way back up the stairs, pausing a moment to consider the body, bent, neck broken, in a way that looked believable considering the fall. The coffee had tumbled with the professor and left a trail down the steps, the shattered cup beside his shattered body. Eli had been careful not to step in the liquid. He wiped his hands on his jeans and retrieved the backpack from the landing, but couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he stood there, waiting for the sense of horror, the nausea, the guilt, to come up to meet him. But it never came. There was only quiet. And then a bell rang through the building, taking the quiet with it, and Eli was left with only a body and a sudden urge to run. Eli crossed the parking lot as his mind spun over what to do next. The peace he'd felt in the stairwell had been replaced by a prickling energy and the voice in his head that whispered, "Go." It wasn't guilt or even panic, more like self-preservation. He reached his car and slid the key into the door, and that's when he heard the steps behind him. "Mr. Cardale." "Go," growled the thing in his head, so clear and so tempting, but something else held him in place. He turned the key in the car door, locking it with a small click. "Can I help you?" he asked, turning toward the man. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with black hair. "My name is Detective Stell. Were you coming or going?" Eli pulled the key from the door. "Coming. I thought I should tell Professor Line. About Victor, that is. They were close. I'll walk with you." Eli nodded and took a step from the car before frowning. I'll leave my bag here," he said, unlocking the door and tossing the backpack, folders and hard drive and all, into the back seat. "I don't feel up to class today." "I'm sorry for your loss," said Detective Stell automatically. Eli counted the steps back to the pre-med labs. He got to 34 before he heard the sirens and looked up sharply. Beside him, Stell swore and picked up his pace. They'd found Lyne's body then. "Run, run, run," hissed the thing in Eli's head. It sang in the same tone and speed as the sirens. And he did run, but not away. His feet carried him toward the building's entrance and through, following the emergency response team as it made its way to the base of the stairs. When Eli saw the body, he made a strangled sound. Stell pulled him away, and Eli let his legs go out beneath him, knees hitting the cold floor with a crack. He winced even as the bruises bloomed and faded under his pant legs. "Come on, son," Stell was saying, pulling him back, but Eli's gaze was leveled on the scene. Everything was playing out as it should, as it needed to. The loose threads being snipped. Until he saw the janitor, leaning against the wall, watching, frowning in the way people frown when they're puzzling out a riddle. "Shit," thought Eli. But he must have said it aloud, because Stell tugged him to his feet and said, "Shit indeed, let's go." There were too many deaths, too fast. He knew he'd be a suspect. Had to be. "Run," said the thing in his head, urgent, and then pleading, plucking his muscles and nerves, but he couldn't. If he ran now, they'd follow. So he didn't run. In fact, he played the part of victim pretty well. Devastated, angry, traumatized, and above all, cooperative. When Detective Stell pointed out that anyone around him was either dead or close to it, Eli did his best to look heartbroken. He explained Victor's jealousy both over his girlfriend and over his rank in the class. Victor had always been a step behind. He must have snapped. People do. When Detective Stell asked Eli about his thesis, he explained that it had been his until Victor usurped it, went behind his back, and started working with Lyne. And then he leaned in and told Stell that Victor hadn't been himself the past few days, that something was different, wrong, and that if he survived, he was still in ICU. They should all be very careful. Eli's thesis was waived in light of the trauma. Trauma. The word haunted him through his police questioning and his academic meetings, all the way to the school-sanctioned single apartment they'd moved him into. Trauma. The word that had helped him crack the code, helped him pinpoint the origin of EOs. Trauma became a kind of hall pass. If only they knew how much trauma he had sustained. They didn't. He stood in the new apartment with the lights off, and let his backpack, they'd never searched the car for it, fall to the floor beside him. It was the first time he'd been alone, truly alone, since he'd left the party in search of Victor. And for a moment, the gap between what he should feel and what he felt snapped shut. Tears began to stream down Eli's face as he sank to his knees on the hardwood floor. "Why is this happening?" he whispered to the empty room. He wasn't sure if he meant the sudden and ferocious sadness, or Lyne's murder, or Angie's death, or Victor's change, or the fact that he was still here in the middle of all of it, unscathed. Unscathed. That was exactly what it was. He had wanted strength, begged for it as the ice water leached the heat and life from his body. But he'd been given this. Resilience. Invincibility. But why? EOs are wrong, and I am an EO, so I must be wrong. It was the simplest of equations, but it wasn't right. Somehow, it wasn't right. He knew in his heart with a strange and simple certainty that EOs were wrong, that they shouldn't exist. But he felt with equal certainty that he wasn't wrong, not in the same way. Different, yes, undeniably different, but not wrong. He thought back to what he'd said in the stairwell. The words had spilled out on their own. "But it's a trade, Professor, with God or the devil." Could that be the difference? He'd seen a demon wearing his best friend's skin, but Eli didn't feel like there was any evil in himself. If anything, he felt hands, strong and steady, guiding him when he pulled the trigger, when he snapped Lyne's neck, when he didn't run from Stell. Those moments of peace, of certainty, they felt like faith. But he needed a sign. God had seemed, in the past few days, like a matchlight next to the sun of Eli's discoveries, but now he felt like a boy again, needing sanction, approval. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and clicked it open. "Would you take it back?" he asked the dark apartment. "If I were no longer of your making? You would take this power back, wouldn't you?" Tears glistened in his eyes. "Wouldn't you?" He cut deep, carving a line from elbow to wrist, wincing as blood welled and spilled, instantly dripping to the floor. "You'd let me die." He switched hands and carved a matching line down his other arm. But before he'd reached his wrist, the wounds were closing, leaving only smooth skin and a small pool of blood. "Wouldn't you?" He cut deeper, through to the bone, over and over, until the floor was red, until he'd given his life to God 100 times, and 100 times had it given back, until the fear and the doubt had all been bled out of him. And then he set the knife aside with shaking hands. Eli dipped his fingers in the slick of red, crossed himself, and got back to his feet. Chapter 5. Around noon, the Esquire Hotel. Eli parked on the street. He hadn't trusted hotel garages since an incident with an earth-shaking EO 3 years earlier. It had taken him 2 full hours to heal, and that was only after he managed to dig himself out of the rubble. Besides, the check-ins and check-outs, tickets and tolls and barricades, garages made quick exits impossible. So Eli parked, crossed the road, and passed through the hotel's elegant entry, a stone and light marquee announcing Merritt's Pride, the Esquire. It had been Serena's choice, and he hadn't been in the mood to defy her. They'd only been there a couple of days since the mishap with Sydney. He'd really hoped the girl would bleed to death in the woods, that maybe 1 or 2 of the bullets he'd fired after her would find skin instead of wood and air. But the drawing in his pocket, and the dead, undead, dead-again Barry lynched, suggested otherwise.
"Afternoon, Mr. Hill."
It took Eli a moment to remember that he was Mr. Hill, and then he smiled and nodded at the woman behind the front desk. Serena was better than a fake ID. He hadn't had to present any ID, in fact, when they checked in, or a credit card. She did come in handy. He didn't like being so dependent on someone else, but he managed to twist it in his mind, to assure himself that while Serena made things easier, smoother, she was sparing him effort that he was more than capable of exerting, if necessary. In this way, she wasn't essential, only terribly convenient. Halfway to the elevator, Eli passed a man. He made a quick mental profile of the stranger, half out of habit and half out of a gut feeling of wrongness, a kind of sixth sense acquired over a decade of studying people, as if they were all spot-the-difference pictures. The hotel was expensive, sleek, the majority of its clientele in suits. This man was wearing something that might pass for a suit, but he was massive, tattoos peeking out from his pushed-up sleeves and collar. He was reading something as he walked, and never looked up, and the woman behind the desk didn't seem concerned, so Eli shelved the man's face somewhere in mental reach and went upstairs. He took the elevator to the 9th floor and let himself in. The suite was pleasant yet sparse, with an open kitchen, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a balcony-aided view over Merritt. But no Serena. Eli tossed his satchel onto the couch and sat down at the desk in the corner, where a laptop sat on top of a daily paper. He woke the device and, as the Merritt Police database loaded, pulled the folded drawing from his pocket and set it on the desk, smoothing its corners. The database gave a small chirp, and he entered through the digital back door Officer Dane and Detective Stell had set up for him. He then scrolled through the folders until he found the file he was looking for. Beth Kirk stared at him, blue hair framing her face. He stared back at her for a moment, and then dragged the profile into the trash. Chapter 6. 10 years ago, Lockland University. Eli was sitting in the school-sanctioned single apartment eating Chinese takeout from lids when the report came on the news. Dale Sykes, a custodian at Lockland University, had been involved in a fatal hit-and-run accident while walking home from work the night before. Eli speared another piece of broccoli. He hadn't meant to do it. That is to say, he hadn't set out in his car with the intent to kill the janitor. But he had unearthed Sykes' rotation schedule, and he had gotten in his car at the same time that Sykes clocked out of his once-a-week night shift. And he had seen him crossing the road, and he had sped up. But it was a series of circumstances lined up in such a way that any one of them could so easily have shifted a matter of seconds and spared the man's life. It was the only way Eli could think of to give the janitor a chance, or rather, to give God a chance to intervene. Sykes wasn't an EO, no, but he was a loose end, and as Eli's car drove over him with a thud, thud, and that moment of quiet filled Eli's chest, he knew he'd done the right thing. Now he sat slumped in a chair at the kitchen table while the story played out on screen, looking over his Chinese food at 2 stacks of paper. The first was made up of his own thesis notes, specifically early case studies, website stills, testimonies, and the like. The second stack held the contents of Line's blue folder. Eli's theory on the causation of EO-ness was there, but Line had added his own notes on the circumstances and factors used to identify a potential EO. To near-death experiences, the professor had added a term Eli had heard him use before, post-traumatic death disorder, or the psychological instabilities resulting from the NDE, and another one that must be new, rebirth principle, or the patient's desire either to escape the life they had before or to redefine themselves based on their ability. Eli had crinkled his nose at the second one. He didn't like recognizing himself in these notes. He had a good reason for reading them, though, because what he'd felt when he drove over Dale Sykes was the same thing he felt when he tried to end Victor's life. Purpose. And he was beginning to figure out what that purpose was. EOs were an affront to nature, to God, that he knew. They were unnatural and they were strong, but Eli would always be stronger. His power was a shield against theirs, impenetrable. He could do what ordinary people couldn't. He could stop them. But he had to find them first, which is why he was combing through the research, pairing Line's methods with the case studies, hoping one of them would give him a place to start. Victor had always been better at these kinds of puzzles. He could take one look and see the connective threads, no matter how thin. But Eli persisted, scouring his files as the news in the background came and went and came again. And finally, he found it. A lead. From a newspaper article Eli had saved on a whim. A man's family had been killed in a freak accident, crushed to death. It had happened only a few months after he himself had nearly died in a building collapse. Only his first name, Wallace, was given, and the paper, which came from a city about an hour away, called him a local. Eli stared at the name for several minutes before digging up a screenshot of an online forum, one of those sites where 99.5% of the people are hacks looking for a little attention. But Eli had been thorough and printed it off anyway. He'd even found a list of members who belonged to the site. One of them, a Wallace 47, had only posted once on a buried thread. It was dated last year, between his own accident and that of his family's. All it said was, "No one is safe near me." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as he tossed his takeout container in the trash and snapped the television off, Eli wanted to go, to run. Not away, but toward something. He had a goal, a mission. But he knew he had to wait. He counted down the days until graduation, all the while feeling the attention of the professors, the counselors, and the cops on him, like the sun in summer. At first it was glaring, but eventually, as the months wore on, it lessened until, by the time he took his exams, most even forgot to look concerned when he entered the room. When the year finally ended, he packed casually, did a last lazy pass through his place, and locked the door. He slid the key into a school-sanctioned white envelope and dropped it off in the mailbox outside residential services. And then, and only then, when the campus of Lockland had vanished into the distance. Eli shrugged off the name Cardale in favor of Ever, and went to seek out his purpose. Eli didn't enjoy killing. He did quite like the moment after, the glorious quiet that filled the air as his broken bones healed and his torn skin closed, and he knew that God approved. But the killing itself was messier than he anticipated. And he didn't like the term, killing. What about removal? Removal was a better word. It made the targets sound less like humans, which they weren't really. Semantics. Regardless, it was messy. The profusion of violence on television had led Eli to believe that killing was clean. A small cough of a gun, the quick jab of a knife, a moment of shock. The camera cuts away, and life goes on. Easy. And to be fair, Line's death had been easy. So had Sykes, really, since the car had done the work. But as Eli peeled a blood-soaked pair of latex gloves from his hands, he found himself wishing the camera would cut to a more pleasant moment. Wallace had put up a fight. Late 50s, but ox-strong. He'd even bent one of Eli's favorite knives before snapping it right in two. Eli leaned against the brick wall and waited for his ribs to notch back into place before hauling the body toward the nearest pile of trash. The night was warm, and he checked himself for blood before leaving the alley, the quiet already fading, leaving a strange sadness in its wake. He felt lost again, purposeless. Even with his lead, it had taken him 3 weeks to find the EO. It was a slow, clumsy pursuit. He'd wanted to be sure, he'd needed proof. After all, what if he guessed wrong? Eli had no desire to rack up a body count of humans. Line and Sykes had been exceptions, victims of circumstance, their deaths unfortunate but necessary. And, if Eli was being honest with himself, sloppy. He knew he could do better. Wallace had been an improvement. As with any pursuit, there was a learning curve, but he firmly believed in the old saying, practice makes perfect. Chapter 7. Around noon, the Esquire Hotel. Victor and Sidney sat in the hotel room eating cold pizza and looking over the profiles Mitch had set out for them. Mitch himself had gone to run an errand, and even though Victor's eyes tracked over the profile of a middle-aged man named Zachary Flinch, his mind was far more on the cell phone, ready and within reach on the counter beside him, and on the name Stell, than his papers. His fingers tapped out a quiet beat on his leg. On the opposite side of his phone sat the profile of a younger man named Dominic Rusher. Sidney sat perched on a nearby stool, finishing her second slice of pizza. Victor saw her steal a glance at Eli's newspaper photo, tucked beneath the corner of the third profile, which belonged to the blue-haired girl, Beth Kirk. He watched as she reached out and drew the article free, staring down at it with her wide blue eyes. "Don't worry, Sid," said Victor. "I'll make him hurt." For a moment, she was quiet, her face a mask. And then it cracked.
"When he came after me,"
she said,
"he told me it was for the greater good."
She spat the last 3 words.
"He said I was unnatural, that I went against God, that was the reason he gave for trying to kill me. I didn't think it was a very good reason."
She swallowed.
"But it was enough for my sister to hand me over."
Victor frowned. The issue of Sidney's sister, Serena, still bothered him. Why hadn't Eli killed her yet? He seemed hell-bent on killing everyone else. "I'm sure it's complicated," he said, looking up from the profile in his hands. "What can your sister do?" Sidney hesitated.
"I don't know. She never showed me. She was supposed to, but then her boyfriend kind of shot me. Why?"
"Because," he said, "Eli's keeping her around. There must be a reason. She must be valuable to him." Sidney looked down and shrugged. "But," added Victor, "if it were based on value alone, he would have kept you around. His loss is my gain." A ghost of a smile crossed Sidney's mouth. She tossed her pizza crust to the black mass on the floor. Dahl perked up and caught it before it hit the ground. He then hoisted himself to his feet and made his way around the counter to Victor, eyeing the crust expectantly. Victor fed it to him and gave the dog's ears, which came to his stomach even sitting on the stool, a short scratch. He looked from the beast to Sidney. He really was collecting strays. Victor's cell rang. He dropped the paper and lifted the phone all in one motion. "Yes." "Got him," said Mitch.
"Dane or Stell?"
"Dane, and I even found us a room."
"Where?"
asked Victor, pulling on his coat. "Look out your window." Victor strode up to the floor-to-ceiling panes and took in the view. Across the road and 2 buildings down was the skeleton of a high-rise. Wooden construction walls encircled the scaffolding. A banner that read Falcon Price was plastered on the front, but there were no workers. The project had either been paused or abandoned.
"Perfect," said Victor. "I'm on my way."
He hung up and saw Sidney already off her stool and clutching her own red coat, waiting. He couldn't help but think she had the same expression as Dahl, expectant, hopeful.
"No, Sidney," he said. "I need you to stay here."
"Why?" she asked.
"Because you don't think I'm a bad person," he said, "and I don't want to prove you wrong."
Victor wound his way through the plastic sheeting that cordoned off the unfinished spaces of the high-rise's ground floor, his steps echoing off concrete and steel. The fine coat of dust on the more exposed outer rooms of the building suggested a recently abandoned project, but the quality of the materials and the prime location made him think it wouldn't stay abandoned for very long. Buildings in transition were perfect places for meetings like this. A few veils of tarp later, he found Mitch and a man in a fold-out chair. Mitch looked bored. The man in the chair looked indignant and, under that, terrified. Victor could practically feel the fear, a fainter version of the radar-like ripple caused by pain. The man was lean, with short dark hair and a sharp jaw. His hands were bound behind his back with duct tape, and he was still in his uniform, the collar darkened in places by blood. The blood came from his cheek, or his nose, or perhaps both. Victor couldn't quite tell. A few drops had dripped onto the badge over his heart.
"I have to admit," said Victor, "I was hoping for Stell."
"You said either one would do. Stell was out. I caught this one on a smoke break," said Mitch. Victor smiled beatifically as he turned his attention to the man in the chair.
"Smoking's bad for you, Officer Dane."
Officer Dane said something, but the duct tape over his mouth made it unintelligible.
"You don't know me,"
continued Victor. He put his boot on the side of the fold-out chair and tipped it. Officer Dane tumbled out, hitting the floor with a crack and a muffled yelp, and Victor caught the chair before it fell, turned it in one lithe motion, and sat down.
"I'm a friend of a friend, and I'd greatly appreciate your help."
He sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees.
"I want you to tell me your access codes to the police database."
Officer Dane frowned. So did Mitch. "Vic," he said, hunching over so Dane wouldn't hear.
"What do you need that for? I hacked you in."
Victor didn't seem to care if the officer overheard.
"You gave me eyes, and I'm grateful. But I want to make a post, and in order to do that, I need a recognized ID."
It was time to send another message, and Victor wanted every detail perfect. The flagged profiles had author tags, and as Mitch himself had pointed out, all of them belonged to one of 2 people, Stell or Dane.
"Besides," said Victor, sliding to his feet, "this is way more fun."
The air in the room began to hum. The exposed skeleton of the building reflected back the energy until the whole space buzzed.
"You should wait outside," he said to Mitch.
Victor had perfected his art. He could pick a person out of a crowd and drop them like a stone. But he still didn't like bystanders, just in case. Now and then he got a touch too zealous and the pain spilled over, leaked into others. Mitch knew him well enough and didn't ask questions, just tugged a veil of plastic tarp aside and left. Victor watched him go, flexing his fingers as if he needed them supple. He felt a faint pang of guilt at involving Mitch in this at all. It's not as though hacking was the only reason the man had ended up in such a high-security prison, but still. Abducting an officer was a serious offense. Not as serious as the crimes Victor himself was about to commit, of course, but given Mitch's record, it wouldn't look good. He'd considered dismissing his friend as soon as they were on the free side of the Wrighton Penitentiary fence, but the simple fact was that Victor didn't possess superhuman strength, and someone would have to help him dispose of bodies. That, and he'd grown rather accustomed to Mitch's presence. He sighed and turned his attention to the officer who was trying to speak. Victor crouched, his knee digging down into the man's chest as he peeled the duct tape back.
"You don't know what you're doing,"
growled Officer Dane.
"You'll fry for this."
Victor smiled quietly. "Not with your help."
"Why should I help you?"
Victor returned the tape to his mouth and stood.
"Oh, you shouldn't."
The hum in the air sharpened, and Officer Dane's body spasmed, his scream muffled by the tape.
"But you will."
Chapter 8. This afternoon, the Esquire Hotel. Eli was staring down at the gridded screen of the police database when he heard the door open behind him. He tapped the screen, closing the profile of a suspected EO named Dominic Rusher, just as a pair of slim arms wrapped around his shoulders, and a pair of lips grazed his ear. "Where have you been?" he asked.
"Looking for Sydney."
He tensed. "And?"
"No luck yet, but I put the word out. At least we'll have a few more pairs of eyes. How is the bank?"
"I don't trust Stell," said Eli for the 100th time. Serena sighed.
"How was Barry Lynch?"
"Dead again by the time I got there." He lifted the childlike drawing from the desk, handed it blindly back to her. "But he left this." He felt the drawing plucked from his fingers, and a moment later, Serena said,
"I didn't know Victor was so thin."
"This isn't a time for joking," snapped Eli. Serena spun his chair to face her. Her eyes were cold as ice.
"You're right," she said. "You told me you killed Sydney."
"I thought I did." Serena leaned down and slid the prop glasses from Eli's face. He'd forgotten he was still wearing them. She tucked them into her hair like a makeshift headband and kissed him, not on the lips, but between the eyes, the place that wrinkled whenever he resisted her.
"Did you really?"
She breathed against him. He forced his skin to smooth beneath her kiss. It was easier to think when she wasn't looking in his eyes.
"I did."
He sighed inwardly with relief as he said it. 2 small words, half-truth at most, and nothing more. It was hard, and it left him drained, but there was no doubt he was getting better at holding back. She pulled away long enough to hold him with her cold blue eyes. He could see the devil in them, silver-tongued and cunning, and Eli thought, not for the first time, that he should have killed her when he had the chance. Chapter 9. Last fall, University of Merit. The music was loud enough to shake the pictures on the walls. An angel and a wizard made out on the stairs. 2 naughty cats tugged a vampire between them, a guy with yellow contacts howled, and someone spilled a solo cup of cheap beer near Eli's feet. He snagged the horns from a devil by the front door and set them on top of his head. He'd seen the girl walk in, flanked by a Barbie and a Catholic schoolgirl flaunting numerous uniform infractions, but she was in jeans and a polo, blonde hair loose, falling over her shoulders. He'd lost sight of her for only a moment, and now her friends were there, weaving through the crowd with interlocking fingers held over their heads. But she was gone. She should have stood out, the lack of costume conspicuous at a Halloween party, but she was nowhere to be found. He swept through the house, avoiding the attempts of several pretty undergrads to delay him. It was flattering, and after all, he looked the part. He'd looked the part for 10 years, but he was here on business. And then, after several unsuccessful tours of the first floor, she found him. A hand pulled him onto the stairs into the shadows.
"Hi there,"
whispered the girl, all the music and all the shouting, and somehow he could still hear her.
"Hi."
he breathed against her. Her fingers intertwined with his as she led him up the stairs, away from the deafening party and into a bedroom that wasn't hers, judging by the way she glanced around before stepping through. College girls, thought Eli cheerfully. You had to love them. He pulled the door shut behind him, and the world in the room became blissfully quiet. The music dulled into a kind of thrum. The lights were off, and they left them off, the only illumination pouring in through the window in the form of moonlight and street lamps. A Halloween party and no costume? Teased Eli. The girl pulled a magnifying glass from her back pocket.
Sherlock,
she explained. Her movements were slow, almost sleepy. Her eyes were the color of water in winter, and he didn't know what her power was. He hadn't studied her long enough, hadn't waited for a demonstration, or rather, had been studying and waiting for weeks, but hadn't been able to catch sight of the ability, whatever it was, so he decided to get a bit closer. It broke his rules, and he knew it, and yet here he was.
"And you are?"
she asked. Eli realized he was too tall for her to see. He bowed his head and pointed to the horns balanced on top. They were red and sequined, and glittered in the darkened room. "Mephistopheles," he said. She laughed. She was an English major, he knew that much, and it was fitting, he thought, one devil to lure another. "Original," she said with a bored smile. "Serena Clark. That was the name in his notes. She was beautiful in the most careless way. The little makeup she wore looked like an afterthought, and Eli had a hard time breaking her gaze. He was used to pretty girls, but Serena was different. More. When she pulled him in for a kiss, he nearly forgot the chloroform in his back pocket. Her hand slid down his spine to his jeans, and he peeled them away just before her fingers skimmed the bottle and the folded cloth. He guided her hands up the wall and over her head, pinning them there as they kissed. She tasted like cold water. He'd meant to push her out the window. Instead, he let her push him back onto the stranger's bed. The chloroform dug into his hip, but when he looked away from her, she guided his eyes and his attention back with only a finger and a smile and a whispered command. A thrill ran through him, one he hadn't felt in years. Longing.
"Kiss me,"
she said. And he did. Eli couldn't, for the life of him, not kiss her. And as his lips found hers, she pinned his hands above him playfully, her blonde hair tickling his face.
"Who are you?"
she asked. Eli had decided that tonight his name would be Gil, but when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "Eli Ever." What the hell?
"How alliterative,"
said Serena.
"What brings you to the party?"
"I came to find you." The words came out before Eli even noticed he was talking. He stiffened under her, and somewhere in his mind he knew that this was bad, knew he needed to get up. But when he went to free himself, the girl cooed.
"Don't go. Lie still."
And his body betrayed him, relaxing beneath her fingers even as his heart hammered in his chest.
"You stand out,"
she said.
"I've seen you before. Last week."
Actually, Eli had been following her for 2 weeks, hoping to catch a glimpse of her ability. No such luck. Until now. He willed his body to move, but it wanted to lie beneath her. He wanted to lie beneath her.
"Are you following me?"
She said it almost playfully, but Eli answered. "Yes."
"Why?"
she asked, letting go of his hands but still straddling him. Eli managed to push himself onto his elbows. He fought the answer down like bile. "Don't say to kill you. Don't say to kill you. Don't say to kill you." He felt the words claw their way up into his throat. "To kill you." The girl frowned decidedly but didn't move.
"Why?"
The answer poured out. "You're an EO," he said. "You have an ability that goes against nature, and it's dangerous. You're dangerous." Her mouth quirked.
"Says the boy trying to kill me."
"I don't expect you to understand."
"I do. But you're not going to kill me tonight, Eli.
She said it so casually. He must have frowned because she added,
Don't look so disappointed. You can always try again tomorrow.
The room was dark and the party thudded beyond the walls. The girl leaned forward and plucked the red sequined horns from his dark hair, nestling them in her own blonde waves. She was lovely, and he struggled to think straight, to remember why she had to die. And then she said,
You're right, you know.
About what? Asked Eli. His thoughts felt slow.
I'm dangerous. I shouldn't exist. But what gives you the right to kill me?
Because I can.
Bad answer,
she said, running her fingers along his jaw. And then she let her body slip down on top of his, jean to jean, and hip to hip, and skin to skin.
Kiss me again,
she ordered. And he did. Serena Clark spent half her time wishing she were dead, and the other half telling everyone around her what to do and wishing someone wouldn't do it. She'd asked to leave the hospital, and the sea of staff had practically parted to let her pass before her IV was even out. It had been pleasant at first, getting her way so easily, if not a little foreign. Serena had always been strong, always ready to fight for something she wanted. But suddenly, there was no need, because the fight had gone out of everyone else. The world went limp around her, a complacent glaze filling the eyes of anyone she met and spoke to. The lack of opposition, of tension, became maddening. Her parents simply nodded when she said she wanted to go back to school. Her teachers ceased to be a challenge. Her friends bent and bent and bent to every whim. Boys lost their fire, gave her anything she wanted and anything she didn't want, but was bored enough to ask for. Where before Serena's world had bowed beneath the strength of her will, now it simply bowed. She didn't have to argue. She didn't have to try. She felt like a ghost. And worst of all, Serena hated to admit how easy and addictive it was, getting her way, even when it made her miserable. Every time she got tired of trying to make people fight her, she would slink back into the comfort of control. She couldn't turn it off. Even when she didn't order, even when she only suggested, only asked, they did it. She felt like a god. She dreamed of people who could fight back, of will strong enough to resist her. And then, one night, she got mad, truly mad, at the boy she was seeing, at the stupid, glazed look in his eyes that she knew too well. And when he refused to fight her, refused to deny her, because for some infuriating reason she couldn't order him to do that, his desire to bend superseding any attempted violence, she told him to go jump off a bridge. And he did. Serena remembered sitting cross-legged on her bed and listening to the news, her friends huddled on the comforter around her, but not touching. There seemed to be a thin wall separating them from her, fear, or maybe awe. And it was then she realized that she wasn't a ghost, or a god. She was a monster. Eli examined the small blue card the girl had slipped into his pocket the night before. On one side she'd written the name of a cafe off the main library, the Light Post, it was called, along with the time, 2 p.m. On the other side, she'd written Scheherazade. She'd even spelled it correctly. Eli knew the reference, of course, Arabian Nights, the woman who told the Sultan stories and never finished at night, lest he kill her. Instead, she drew the stories over until the next day. As he made his way through U of Merit's campus, he felt hung over for the first time in a decade, his head heavy and his thoughts slow. It had taken him most of the morning to drag fully free of the girl's compulsion, to think of her as a target, only a target. He slipped the card back into his pocket. He knew Serena wouldn't show up. She'd be a fool to come anywhere near him after last night, after he'd admitted his intentions. And yet, there she was, sitting on the patio of the Light Post wearing sunglasses and a dark blue sweater, her blonde hair wisping around her face. "Do you have a death wish?" Eli asked, standing beside the table. She shrugged.
I've done it once. The novelty must be wearing off.
She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Eli weighed his options, but he couldn't exactly kill her in the middle of campus, so he sat down.
"Serena," she said,
sliding the sunglasses on top of her head. In the daylight her eyes were even lighter.
"But you already know my name."
She sipped her coffee. Eli said nothing.
"Why do you want to kill me?"
she asked.
"And don't say because you can."
The moment Eli's thoughts formed, they were sliding across his tongue. He frowned as the words spilled out. "EOs are unnatural."
"You said that already."
"My best friend became one, and I saw the change. Like a devil had climbed into his skin. He killed my girlfriend, and then he tried to kill me." He bit into his tongue and managed to stem the flow of words. Was it her eyes or her voice that was compelling him?
"So you go around blaming every other EO you can find," said Serena, "punishing them in his place."
"You don't understand," he said. "I'm trying to protect people." She smiled behind her coffee. It wasn't a happy smile.
"Which people?"
"The normal ones." Serena scoffed. "The natural ones," pressed Eli. "Extraordinary shouldn't exist. They haven't just been given a second chance, they've been given a weapon and no manual, no rules. Their very existence is criminal. They aren't whole." The thin smile fell from Serena's red lips.
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that when a person revives as an EO, not all of them comes back. Things are missing." Even Eli, blessed as he was, knew that he was missing pieces. Important things like empathy and balance and fear and consequence. Those things that might temper their abilities, they're missing. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you feel all those things the way you did before." Serena leaned forward, setting her coffee and a stack of books. She didn't contradict him. Instead, she said,
"And what is your ability, Eli Ever?"
"What makes you think I have one?" He spat the words out as quickly as he could, filling the need to speak. It was such a small victory, countering like that, but he knew she registered it. And then her smile sharpened.
"Tell me your power," she said.
This time he answered. "I heal." She laughed, loud enough that one or two students glanced over from tables across the patio.
"No wonder you have a wicked sense of entitlement."
"What do you mean?"
"Well, your gift doesn't impact anyone else. It's reflexive. So in your mind, you're not a threat, but the rest of us are."
Serena tapped the stack of books, and Eli could make out psychology titles mingled in with the English books.
"Am I close?"
Eli wasn't sure he liked Serena very much. He wanted to tell her about his covenant, but instead he asked, "How did you know I'm an EO?"
"Everything about you," she said,
sliding her sunglasses back on,
"is chock full of self-loathing. I'm not judging. I know the feeling."
Her watch gave a small beep, and she dragged herself to her feet. Even that simple motion was lovely and fluid, like water.
"You know, maybe I should let you kill me, because you're right. Even though we come back, something stays dead, lost. We forget something of who we were. It's scary, and wonderful, and monstrous."
She looked so sad in that moment, ringed with afternoon light, and Eli had to resist the urge to go to her. Something fluttered in him. She reminded him of Angie, or rather, how he had felt around Angie before everything had changed, before he had changed. 10 years of staring across the chasm at the things he'd lost, and now, looking at this girl, it was like the chasm was shrinking, the gap pulling closed until his fingers could almost skim the other side. He wanted to be close to her, wanted to make her happy, wanted to reach across the rift and remember. He bit down again until he tasted blood to clear his mind. He knew the feelings weren't his, not entirely, not naturally. There was no going back. He was the way he was for a reason, a purpose. And this girl, this monster, had a dangerous, complicated gift. It wasn't a simple compulsion, it was an attraction, a want to please, a need to please, They were her feelings filtering through him, not his own.
"We're all monsters,"
she said, taking up her books.
"But so are you."
Eli was only half listening, but still the words began to trickle through him, and he pushed them violently away before they could settle in his mind. He got to his feet, but she was already turning away.
"You can't kill me today," she called back. "I'm late for class."
Eli sat on a bench outside the psychology building, his head tipped back. It was a beautiful day, cloudy but not gray, cold but not bitter, and the breeze that tugged at his collar and wove through his hair kept him alert. His mind was clear again, now that Serena was gone, and he knew he had a problem. He needed to kill the girl without seeing her, without hearing her. If she were unconscious, he mused, then he might be able to—
"Aren't you picturesque?"
The voice was cool and warm at once. Serena clutched her books to her chest and looked down at him.
"What were you thinking about?"
she asked. "Killing you," he said. It was almost freeing, not being able to lie. Serena shook her head slowly and sighed.
"Walk me to my next class."
He stood.
"Tell me,"
she said, weaving her arm through his.
"At the party last night, how were you going to kill me?"
Eli watched the clouds. "Drug you and push you out the window."
"That's cold," she said.
Eli shrugged. "But believable. Kids get drunk at parties. After discretion, their balance is the first thing to go. They fall, sometimes out of windows."
"So,"
she said, leaning against him. Her hair tickled his cheek.
"Do you have a cape?"
"Are you mocking me?"
"More of a mask type, then?"
"What are you getting at?" he asked as they reached her next building.
"You're the hero,"
she said, finding his eyes.
"Of your own story, anyway."
She started up the steps.
"Will I see you again? Do you have me penciled in for a redo sometime this week? I just want to know so I can bring my mace. Put up a fight at least, for realism's sake."
Serena was the strangest girl Eli had ever met. He told her so. She smiled and went inside. Serena's eyes brightened when she saw him again the next day. Eli was waiting on the building steps in the late afternoon with a cup of coffee in each hand. The dusk smelled like dead leaves and far-off fires. His breath escaped in small clouds as he held one of the coffees out to her, and she took it and slipped her arm through his again.
"My hero,"
she said, and Eli smiled at the inside joke. In nearly 10 years, he hadn't let anyone close, certainly not an EO. Yet here he was, walking through the twilight with one, and he liked it. He tried to remind himself that the sensation was false, projected, tried to convince himself that this was research, that he was only trying to understand her gift and how best to eliminate her, even as he let her guide him down the steps and away from the campus.
"So, you protect the innocent world from the big bad EOs,"
she said as they made their way arm in arm.
"How do you find them?"
"I have a system." As they walked, he explained to her his method, the careful narrowing down of targets based on Line's 3 steps, the periods of observation.
"Sounds tedious,"
she said. "It is."
"And then when you find them, you just kill them?"
Her step slowed.
"No questions, no trial, no assessment of whether they're a danger or a threat?"
"I used to talk to them. Not anymore."
"What gives you the right to play judge and jury and executioner?"
God. He hadn't wanted to say the word, hadn't wanted to give this strange girl the power of knowing his beliefs, of twisting and bending them to her own. She pursed her lips, the word hanging in the air between them, but she didn't mock him.
"How do you kill them?"
she asked eventually. "It depends on their ability," he said. "Default is a gun, but if there's a concern regarding metal or explosives, or the setup, I have to find another method, like with you. You're young, and you'd probably be missed, which would be messy, and that therefore ruled out a crime. I needed to make it look like an accident." They turned onto a side street lined with small apartment buildings and houses.
"What's the strangest way you've ever killed someone?"
Eli thought about it. Bear trap. Serena cringed.
No details necessary.
A few minutes passed in silence as they walked.
How long have you been doing this?
Asked Serena. 10 years?
No way,
she said, squinting at him.
How old are you?
Eli smiled. How old do I look? They reached her apartment and stopped.
20, maybe 21?
Well, I guess I'm technically 32, but I've looked this way for 10 years.
Part of that whole healing thing?
Eli nodded. Regeneration.
Show me,
said Serena.
How?
Asked Eli. Her eyes glittered.
Do you have a weapon on you?
Eli hesitated a moment, then withdrew a Glock from his coat.
Give it to me,
said Serena. Eli handed it over, but he had the self-possession to frown as he did it. Serena stepped away from him and took aim. Wait, said Eli. He looked around. Maybe not out here, in the street. Let's go inside. Serena considered him for a long moment, then smiled, and let him in. Chapter 10. This afternoon, the Esquire Hotel.
Victor sent you a message,
said Serena, brushing her fingers over Sidney's stick figure in the drawing. There was a fleck of brownish red on the corner of the paper, and she wondered whose blood it was.
Are you going to send one back?
She watched as the answer climbed Eli's throat. I don't know how, he said under his breath.
He's here in the city,
she said. So are millions of other people, Serena, growled Eli.
And they're all on your side, she said. Or they can be.
She took Eli's hand, drew him up from the chair. Her hand slid around his back, pulled him close until his forehead rested against hers.
Let me help you.
She watched his jaw clench. Eli couldn't resist her, not really, but he was trying. She could see the strain in his eyes, in the space between his brows as he fought the compulsion. Every time she asked a question, every time she gave a small order, there was a pause, as if Eli were trying to reprocess the command, twisted until it was his, as if he could take back his will. He couldn't, but she loved to see him try. It gave her something to hold on to. She took it in, savored his resistance, and then, for his sake, she forced him to bend.
Eli,
she said, her voice even and unmovable.
Let me help you.
How? He asked. Her fingers slipped into his front pocket and drew out his phone.
Call Detective Stell. Tell him we need a meeting with the Merritt PD, all of them.
Victor wasn't the only one in the city. Sidney was here, too. Find one, and they would find the other. The drawing told them as much. Eli stared down at his phone. It's too public, he said, fingers punching in the numbers even as he struggled to think. It makes us too public. I haven't made it this long by standing in spotlights.
It's the only way to flush them out. Besides, you shouldn't worry. You're the hero now, remember?
He laughed dryly, but didn't say no again.
Do you want a mask?
She teased, pulling the glasses from her hair and sliding them back onto his face.
Or will these do?
Eli ran his thumb over his phone, hesitating for one last moment. And then he connected the call. Chapter 11. Last fall, University of Merritt. Serena Clark lived alone. Eli could tell from the moment they walked in when she slipped her shoes off by the door. The place was clean, calm, and unified. It had one cohesive taste, and Serena didn't look around for anyone before turning on him and raising the gun. Hold up, said Eli, shrugging off his coat. This is my favorite. I'd rather not have holes in it. He took a small cylinder from the pocket and tossed it to her. Do you actually know how to use a gun? He asked. Serena nodded as she screwed the silencer on.
Years of crime dramas, and I found my father's Colt once and taught myself. Cans in the woods and all that.
Are you a decent shot? Eli unbuttoned his shirt and took that off, too, draping it over the entry table with his coat. Serena gave him an appreciative head-to-toe and back look, and then she pulled the trigger. He gasped and staggered backward, red blossoming against his shoulder. The pain was brief and bright, the bullet passing straight through and lodging in the wall behind him. He watched Serena's eyes widen as the wound instantly began to close, his skin knitting back together. She gave a slow clap, the gun still in her grip. Eli rubbed his shoulder and met her eyes. "Happy now?" he grumbled.
"Don't be so sour,"
she said, setting the gun on the table. "Just because I heal," he said, reaching past her for his shirt, "doesn't mean that didn't hurt." Serena caught his arm in one hand and his face in the other, and held his gaze. Eli felt himself falling in.
"Want me to kiss it?"
she asked, brushing her lips against his.
"Will that make it better?"
There it was again, in his chest. That strange flutter, like want. Dusty and a decade old, but there. Maybe it was a trick. Maybe this feeling, this simple mortal ache, wasn't coming from him. Maybe it was. Maybe it could be. He nodded once, just enough to bring their lips together, and then she turned and led him to the bedroom.
"Don't kill me tonight,"
she added as she led him into the dark, and he never even thought of it. Serena and Eli were lying together in a tangle of sheets. They faced each other, and she ran her fingers down his cheek, his throat, his chest. Her hand seemed fascinated with the place where she'd shot him, now only smooth skin shining in the near dark of the room. Her hand wandered, then over his ribs and around his back, and came to rest on the web of old scars there. She drew in a small breath. "They're from before," he said softly. "Nothing leaves marks anymore." Her lips parted, but before she could ask what happened, he added, "Please don't ask." And she didn't. Instead, she drew her hand back to his unscarred chest and let it rest over his heart.
"Where will you go after you kill me?"
"I don't know," he said honestly. "I'll have to start again."
"Will you sleep with that one too?"
she asked, and Eli laughed. "Seduction is hardly part of my method."
"Well then, I feel special."
"You are." It came out in a whisper, and it was true. Special. Different. Fascinating. Dangerous. Her hand slid back to the bed, and he thought perhaps she'd fallen asleep. He enjoyed watching her this way, knowing he could kill her but not wanting to. It made him feel like he was in control again, or closer to it. Being with Serena felt like a dream, an interlude. It made Eli feel human again. It made him forget.
"There must be an easier way,"
she wondered sleepily.
"To find them, if you could access the right networks."
"If only," he whispered, and then they slept. The sun streamed in, but the room was cool. Eli shivered and sat up. The bed was empty beside him. He found his pants and spent several minutes searching for his shirt before he remembered he'd left it by the front door and padded out into the apartment. Serena was gone. His gun was still on the table, and he